Let me tell you about the most powerful institution you were never taught about in school. It controls the value of every dollar in your wallet. It decides whether you can afford a house or get trapped renting forever. It determines whether your savings grow or silently evaporate. It influences whether you have a job next year or join the unemployment line. And yet most people couldn't explain what it actually does if their life depended on it. The Federal Reserve. Created in 1913 in a secret meeting on a private island off the coast of Georgia, owned by private banks, run by unelected officials, accountable to almost no one. Here's what they told you. The Fed exists to stabilize the economy, control inflation, and maximize employment. It's a neutral institution managed by brilliant economists making technical decisions for the public good. Here's what they didn't tell you. Since the Federal Reserve was created, the dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power. The wealth gap has exploded to levels not seen since the Gilded Age. Every major financial crisis, 1929, 2008, 2020, has been preceded by Fed policy that created the bubble in the first place. And right now, in April 2026, the Fed is sitting on a $7 trillion balance sheet. Interest payments on the national debt have exceeded $1 trillion per year, and the chairman himself is publicly warning that this will not end well. Over the next 18 minutes, I'm going to explain exactly how the Federal Reserve works, who it really serves, and why understanding it is the single most important thing you can do to protect your financial future. If you find this valuable, consider subscribing. We cover the economic forces that shape your life, but never make the evening news. Let's begin with a question nobody asks. Who owns the Federal Reserve? In November 1910, 7 men boarded a private rail car in New Jersey. They represented approximately 1/4 of the world's wealth. Among them were representatives of J.P. Morgan, the Rockefeller banking interests, and the largest banks in New York. Their destination, Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private resort owned by some of America's wealthiest families. Their mission, to design a new central banking system for the United States. For 9 days, they met in total secrecy. They used only first names to avoid identification. Servants were told the gathering was a duck hunting trip. What emerged from that meeting became the blueprint for the Federal Reserve Act, passed by Congress 3 years later in December 1913. Now here's what makes this significant. The Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It's a hybrid institution, part public, part private, with a structure so deliberately confusing that most people never bother to understand it. The Fed consists of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. These banks are technically owned by the private commercial banks in their districts. Yes, you heard that right. J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo. They are among the shareholders of the Federal Reserve System. These private banks receive a 6% annual dividend on their shares. In 2023, that amounted to over $1.7 billion paid to private banks for owning the institution that regulates them. The Board of Governors, the 7 people who set monetary policy, are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. So there is democratic input. But once appointed, they serve 14-year terms and cannot be removed for policy disagreements. They are essentially untouchable. The Federal Open Market Committee, which makes the actual decisions about interest rates and money creation, includes both the appointed governors and presidents of the regional Fed banks, who are selected by the private banks themselves. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the actual legal structure. You can read it in the Federal Reserve Act. And this structure matters because it determines who the Fed actually serves when its stated mandates, stable prices and maximum employment, come into conflict with the interests of the banking system. But the ownership structure is just the beginning. To understand why you're broke, you need to understand the Fed's most powerful and least understood tool, the ability to create money from nothing. Here's a question that will reveal how little you were taught about money. Where do dollars come from? Most people vaguely assume the government prints money. Treasury Department, printing presses, new bills entering circulation. That's about 3% of the story. The vast majority of money in the modern economy, over 97%, is not physical cash. It's digital, numbers in bank accounts, and it's not created by the government. It's created by commercial banks when they issue loans. Let me explain how this actually works, because it's the most important economic mechanism you were never taught. When you go to a bank for a mortgage, you might assume the bank is lending you money that someone else deposited. That's the story in economics textbooks. It's wrong. The Bank of England, one of the oldest central banks in the world, published a paper in 2014 that stated explicitly, whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money. Read that again. The bank doesn't lend existing money. It creates new money the moment it approves your loan. The $300,000 mortgage you just took out? That $300,000 didn't exist 5 minutes ago. The bank typed it into existence. This is not fraud. This is the legal, accepted, normal way that money enters the economy. Now here's where the Federal Reserve comes in. Commercial banks can create money through lending, but they face constraints. They need reserves, money held at the Federal Reserve, to settle transactions between banks and meet regulatory requirements. The Fed controls how much reserves exist in the banking system. When the Fed wants to stimulate the economy, it creates new reserves and uses them to buy assets, typically treasury bonds or mortgage-backed securities, from banks. This is called quantitative easing. The Fed created over $4.8 trillion between March 2020 and March 2022 alone. That money didn't come from taxes. It didn't come from savings. It came from nowhere. The Fed simply credited the accounts of banks with new reserves that didn't exist before. Now ask yourself, when trillions of dollars are created from nothing, where does the value come from? The answer is, from you. When the money supply increases faster than the production of goods and services, each existing dollar becomes worth less. Your savings, your wages, your purchasing power, all diluted. This is not a side effect. This is the mechanism. Inflation is not a natural phenomenon like weather. It is a policy choice. And that policy choice transfers wealth from people who hold currency, workers, savers, retirees on fixed incomes, to people who hold assets that rise with inflation, property owners, stockholders, the already wealthy. But here's what makes this truly insidious. The Fed doesn't just control how much money exists. It controls who gets access to new money first, and that determines who wins and who loses in the entire economy. In the 18th century, an Irish-French economist named Richard Cantillon made an observation that would explain the wealth inequality of the 21st century. He noticed that when new money enters an economy, it doesn't affect everyone equally or simultaneously. The people who receive the new money first can spend it before prices adjust. The people who receive it last, or never, face higher prices without any increase in their income. This is called the Cantillon Effect. And it explains why you feel poorer every year, even when the economy is supposedly growing. Here's how it works with the Federal Reserve. Step 1. The Fed creates new reserves and uses them to buy bonds from primary dealers, the largest banks and financial institutions. Step 2. Those institutions now have more money to lend and invest. They buy assets, stocks, real estate, corporate bonds. Step 3. Asset prices rise. The wealth of people who already own assets increases. Step 4. The new money gradually works its way through the economy. Banks lend to corporations. Corporations hire workers. Eventually, some of that money reaches wages. Step 5. By the time workers receive their slightly higher paychecks, prices have already adjusted upward. The real purchasing power of that wage increase is diminished or eliminated. This isn't speculation. We can see it in the data. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston published research showing that high-income consumers have been driving the growth in spending in recent years, while low-income spending has actually declined in real terms. Deloitte's 2026 analysis found that the lowest-earning 60% of Americans are no better off financially than they were 3 years ago. Research by economists at the Federal Reserve itself shows that real consumer spending has grown for high-income households since 2023, but has remained flat for middle-income households and declined for low-income households. In the second quarter of 2025, the top 10% of Americans were responsible for 49% of all consumer spending, half of all spending, by 1/10 of the population. This is what the Cantillon Effect looks like at scale. The people closest to the money spigot, banks, large corporations, wealthy investors, capture most of the benefit. By the time new money reaches ordinary workers, it has already lost much of its purchasing power. And it's not just about money creation. It's about interest rates. When the Fed holds rates artificially low, it subsidizes borrowing. Who can borrow? Corporations buying back their own stock. Private equity firms loading companies with debt. Real estate investors financing their 10th property. Who can't borrow or borrows at punishing rates? Students. First-time homebuyers. Small businesses. The Fed doesn't just create money. It creates winners and losers. And somehow, the winners are always the people who were already winning. If this is making you see the economy differently, consider subscribing. We analyze these systems because understanding them is the first step to navigating them. But we're still not at the darkest part. Because the Fed doesn't just transfer wealth from workers to asset owners in normal times. It actively bails out the wealthy when their bets go wrong, while letting ordinary people suffer the consequences. September 2008. Lehman Brothers collapses. The financial system freezes. We're told we're days away from ATMs not working, grocery stores not getting deliveries, complete economic breakdown. The Fed's response? Emergency lending programs that would eventually total over $16 trillion in commitments. Direct loans to banks. Currency swaps with foreign central banks. Purchases of toxic assets nobody else would touch. The banks that created the crisis through reckless lending, fraudulent securities, and excessive leverage were rescued. Their shareholders took losses, yes, but the institutions survived. The executives kept their jobs, and in many cases, their bonuses. Meanwhile, 10 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure. Millions more lost jobs. Retirement accounts were devastated. An entire generation's wealth was wiped out. The Fed had the legal authority to help homeowners directly. It chose not to. Instead, it embarked on quantitative easing, buying bonds to push down interest rates and inflate asset prices. The explicit goal was to create a wealth effect that would encourage spending. But here's the problem with the wealth effect. It only works if you own assets. A 2012 Bank of England study found that 40% of the gains from their QE programs went to the richest 5% of households. Richard Fisher, president of the Dallas Fed, admitted, "Cheap money has made rich people richer, but has not done quite as much for working Americans." Now fast forward to March 2020. COVID hits. Markets crash. The Fed's response is even faster and larger than 2008. Within weeks, it had cut interest rates to zero and announced unlimited quantitative easing. It began buying corporate bonds for the first time in history, directly supporting companies, not just banks. The stock market, which had crashed 34% in 5 weeks, recovered everything within 5 months, the fastest recovery in history. Meanwhile, unemployment hit levels not seen since the Great Depression. Small businesses closed by the hundreds of thousands. Many would never reopen. And when the inevitable inflation arrived in 2022, who paid the price? Not the corporations that received cheap loans. Not the investors whose portfolios had been rescued. Workers, renters, families on fixed incomes. People who didn't own assets that rose with inflation. This is the pattern that repeats, cycle after cycle. When the economy is booming, the benefits flow upward. When the economy crashes, the pain flows downward. And the Federal Reserve is the mechanism that makes this happen. They call it monetary policy. A more accurate term would be class warfare with extra steps. But now we arrive at the present moment, April 2026, and the situation has become genuinely dangerous. Because the Fed has painted itself into a corner from which there may be no escape, let me show you the numbers that should terrify anyone paying attention. The national debt has exceeded $39 trillion. It took 200 years to reach the first trillion. Now we add that much in interest payments every single year. In the first 3 months of fiscal year 2026, the government paid $270 billion in interest, more than it spent on defense in the same period. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2056, debt will reach 175% of GDP, $168 trillion. And here's the trap. If the Fed keeps interest rates high to fight inflation, the government's borrowing costs explode. Every 1% increase in rates eventually adds over $300 billion to annual interest payments. But if the Fed cuts rates to reduce borrowing costs, it risks reigniting inflation, which is already elevated due to the Iran war pushing oil prices up 60% in a single month. Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, was asked about this directly. His response: "The level of the debt is not unsustainable, but the path is not sustainable. It will not end well if we don't do something fairly soon." Read that carefully. The person most responsible for managing America's monetary system just told you the current trajectory will not end well. Meanwhile, markets are priced for perfection. The S&P 500's valuation is the highest it's been except for the dot-com bubble. The Buffett indicator, total market cap relative to GDP, sits at 217 to 228%, nearly double what Warren Buffett considers reasonable. And the AI bubble has driven market concentration to dangerous levels. 30% of the entire S&P 500 is held by just 5 companies. A 2026 study from MIT found that 95% of companies investing in AI are getting zero return. Moody's recession model, which has correctly preceded every recession since 1945 when it crossed 50%, currently sits at 49%. One bad data point away from the signal that has never been wrong. Consumer sentiment has collapsed to 53.3, levels associated with active recession. And 40% of Americans, when polled, said they believe an economic collapse is coming. The Fed now faces impossible choices. Option 1: keep rates elevated, fight inflation, but watch the debt spiral and risk recession. Option 2: cut rates, help the debt, but reignite inflation and destroy whatever credibility they have left. Option 3: more QE, create trillions more dollars to buy government bonds and suppress interest rates. But after 2021 to 2022, everyone now understands that QE leads to inflation. The trick doesn't work when people see it coming. There is no good option, and that's because the Fed has spent 2 decades treating symptoms instead of causes, inflating bubbles to escape the consequences of previous bubbles, and transferring wealth upward while pretending to serve the public interest. The bill is coming due. So here's the answer to the question in the title: why are you broke? Because a system was designed in secret in 1910 that allows private banks to create money from nothing when they lend, while the Federal Reserve controls who gets access to that money first. Because when the Fed creates trillions of dollars, it flows through financial institutions and asset markets before it ever reaches your paycheck, and by then, prices have already adjusted. Because when Wall Street makes reckless bets and loses, the Fed bails them out. When you lose your job in the resulting recession, you're on your own. Because inflation is not a mysterious force of nature. It's a policy choice that transfers wealth from people who work for money to people who own assets. Because the entire system is designed to make the rich richer while maintaining just enough stability to prevent the kind of collapse that might lead to actual reform. This isn't a conspiracy. It's not shadowy figures pulling strings in smoky rooms. It's worse than that. It's an open system, operating in plain sight, with mechanisms anyone can study, but that almost no one is taught to understand. The Federal Reserve isn't hiding. It publishes its decisions. It holds press conferences. Its officials give speeches. They just count on the fact that you won't understand what they're saying. Now you do. You understand that money creation benefits first receivers at the expense of everyone else. You understand that low interest rates subsidize the wealthy who can borrow against assets. You understand that bailouts protect the financial system, not the people who depend on it. You understand why your parents could afford a house on 1 income while you struggle with 2. Knowledge doesn't change the system, but it changes how you navigate it. Stop measuring your success in dollars that are being deliberately devalued. Understand that the game is rigged and adjust your strategy accordingly. And maybe, if enough people understand how this actually works, we can start having honest conversations about whether this is the system we want. If this video changed how you see the economy, subscribe. We're building a community of people who refuse to be confused into poverty. I'll see you in the next one. Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws. Attributed to Mayor Amschel Rothschild.